Sarah Mitchell stared at the custody papers spread across her kitchen table, her coffee growing cold beside them. The words blurred together as tears filled her eyes. Custody hearing State versus Mitchell family judge presiding. It was happening tomorrow. After months of legal battles, sleepless nights, and a mountain of paperwork that threatened to bury her, it was finally happening. Her entire future, her daughter's entire future, would be decided by a single judge in a cold courtroom filled with strangers in suits. Her hands trembled as she picked up the stack of papers. The accusations were cruel and carefully crafted. David's legal team had painted her as a negligent mother, a career-obsessed woman who put her job at a prestigious hospital above her own child. The language was inflammatory. Chronic absence, repeated reliance on, failure to prioritize parental duties, potential environmental neglect. Each phrase was a knife wound, each sentence designed not to describe reality but to destroy her credibility. Sarah had been a registered nurse for 7 years. She worked in the emergency room at Metropolitan Hospital, a position she'd fought hard to earn and maintain. It was demanding work, 12-hour shifts, unpredictable schedules, the weight of other people's suffering resting on her shoulders every single day. But it was also meaningful work. She'd saved lives. She'd held the hands of dying patients. She'd delivered hope when hope seemed impossible. And yes, it meant that Maya sometimes went to her grandmother's house, to a trusted babysitter. But that wasn't neglect. That was life. That was being a single mother trying to build something for her child. David had never understood that. When they were together, he'd resented her dedication to her career, as if her ambition was a personal affront to his ego. "You care more about work than about us," he'd said 1,000 times, his voice dripping with contempt. She tried to explain, to help him see that her career gave her independence, stability, and the ability to support their daughter. But David viewed the world through a different lens, a lens where everything revolved around him, his needs, his timeline, his version of how things should be. The divorce had been bitter. It had started simply enough: incompatibility, different life goals, the usual reasons why marriages fail. But when Maya was born, everything changed. David had suddenly decided he wanted full custody, not because he discovered some newfound paternal instinct, but because he knew it would hurt Sarah. It was revenge dressed up in legal language. He hired an associates, one of the most aggressive family law firms in the state. They charged $500 per hour, and David threw money at them like it was water. Sarah had scrounged together enough to hire a competent but overworked public defender who was handling her case alongside 40 others. Was good, genuinely good, but she couldn't compete with David's legal army. The playing field wasn't just uneven, it was a cliff face. Over the past 3 months, David's team had built a narrative that was almost convincing. They documented every time Maya was in someone else's care. They'd obtained her records and highlighted minor incidents, a scraped knee, a day when Maya had caught a cold, as evidence of inadequate supervision. They'd interviewed Sarah's neighbors, apparently looking for any dirt they could find. One elderly neighbor had mentioned that Sarah occasionally worked night shifts, as if that were somehow criminal. The legal team had twisted these mundane facts of working motherhood into a sinister portrait of abandonment. Meanwhile, David presented himself as the concerned father. He'd hired a private investigator, a man who took photographs of Sarah leaving work late, running errands on her lunch break, picking Maya up from. The photos were innocuous, but they told a story if you were predisposed to believe it. A mother too busy to care properly for her child. He'd also strategically mentioned his success in business, his financial resources, his new spacious home in the suburbs with a backyard and excellent schools nearby. He'd painted himself as the responsible parent, the stable adult, the one who would truly put Maya first. What David's legal team had managed to bury, what they'd fought tooth and nail to keep out of the trial, were his anger issues. Sarah's attorney had tried to introduce a report from a therapist, documentation of an incident where David had thrown a chair across a room during one of their marriage counseling sessions. She tried to bring in evidence of his aggressive behavior towards Sarah, instances where he'd made her feel small and scared. But the judge had ruled most of it inadmissible. Hearsay, irrelevant to custody determination, not properly documented. The legal system had built-in protections for men like David. Sarah looked at the photograph of Maya on her refrigerator, a picture from her 3rd birthday party just weeks ago. The little girl was beaming, holding up a cupcake, her eyes full of uncomplicated joy. This child loved her mother. Sarah knew this in her bones. Maya ran to her when she came home from work, clinging to her legs, chattering excitedly about her day. She wanted her mother's approval, her mother's attention, her mother's love. The bond between them was real and deep and irreplaceable. And yet somehow, in the eyes of the law, that might not be enough. Sarah had played out 1,000 scenarios in her head. Best case, the judge would see through David's manipulation, would recognize that Sarah was a loving, dedicated mother who simply worked for a living. She'd maintain primary custody, David would get reasonable visitation, and life would return to some version of normal. Worst case, David would win. He'd get custody of Maya. Sarah would be relegated to supervised visitation, a couple of hours on weekends, always with someone watching, as if she were some kind of threat to her own child. She'd lose her daughter, not completely, but essentially. She'd become a footnote in Maya's life instead of the center of it. The worst case kept her awake at night. Sarah picked up her phone and looked at her recent text thread with David. "I'm her father," he'd written last week. "I have every right to raise her. You can't even be bothered to be home for her bedtime most nights." It wasn't true. Sarah read to Maya every single night she was home, but truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the story, the narrative, the persuasive argument made by expensive lawyers in an intimidating courtroom. She pulled out her laptop and reviewed her notes one more time, had prepared her extensively for testimony. Answer only what you're asked. Don't volunteer information. Stay calm. Don't cry if you can avoid it. Judges sometimes see tears as a weakness. But Sarah wanted to cry. She wanted to scream. She wanted to shake the judge by the shoulders and make her understand that being a working mother didn't make you a bad mother. That loving your child didn't mean being available 24/7. That sometimes the most loving thing you could do was provide for them, educate yourself, maintain your dignity and independence. Tomorrow, all of that would be tested. Tomorrow, a stranger in a black robe would listen to her story and David's story and decide which version of reality to believe. Tomorrow, Sarah's worst fear might come true. She looked at Maya's photo again and whispered a prayer to a God she wasn't sure was listening. Please let her know that I fought for her. Please let her know that I never stopped loving her. Please. The nightmare was just beginning. Sarah arrived at the courthouse at 7:45 a.m., 45 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to begin. She'd barely slept, waking every hour throughout the night, her mind cycling through catastrophic scenarios. She dressed carefully, a navy blazer, professional but not cold, modest jewelry, minimal makeup. Everything about her appearance was calculated to project competence and maternal warmth. She'd even picked out Maya's outfit with agonizing care, a pink dress with small white flowers, hair brushed and braided neatly. She wanted her daughter to look like a well-cared-for child because Maya was a well-cared-for child. The dress alone had taken 20 minutes to choose. Sarah had pulled out 6 different options, second-guessing every selection. The November morning was bitterly cold. Sarah held Maya's small hand as they climbed the granite steps leading to the courthouse entrance. The building was imposing, all stone and steel, designed to intimidate. Maya looked up at her mother, her 3-year-old face confused by the environment around her. "Mommy, where are we?" Maya asked, her voice small and uncertain. "We're at a big building where we have to see the judge, sweetheart," Sarah explained, keeping her voice cheerful despite the knot of anxiety twisting in her stomach. She couldn't let Maya sense her fear. Children were perceptive creatures, picking up on parental anxiety like animals sensing fear. "The judge is a nice lady who's going to listen to us today. We're going to go inside and sit in a special room, okay?" "Okay," Maya said hesitantly, squeezing her mother's hand. Inside, the courthouse was even more intimidating than the exterior suggested. High ceilings, marble floors that echoed with every footstep, the smell of old wood and institutional cleaning products. Sarah's heels clicked against the floor as she walked, the sound hollow and lonely. They passed security screening, a metal detector where the guard barely looked at them, and then they were in the hallway outside courtroom 4B. Was already there, standing with a file folder pressed against her chest. She looked tired. Sarah had learned that always looked tired. It was the occupational hazard of being a public defender with twice as many cases as she could reasonably handle. But when she saw Sarah and Maya, she managed a warm smile. "You made it," said, pulling Sarah aside slightly. "How are you doing?" "I didn't sleep," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I keep thinking about what happens if—" "Don't go there," interrupted gently but firmly. "We've prepared, you know what to expect. Stick to the facts, answer what you're asked, and let me handle the strategy. Okay." Sarah nodded, but the anxiety refused to release its grip on her chest. She looked back at Maya, who was sitting on the hard wooden bench, swinging her legs nervously. The child's earlier cheerfulness had evaporated. She seemed to sense the tension radiating from every adult around her. Across the hallway, David arrived precisely on time. Of course he did. He was always punctual, always controlled, always perfectly presented. He wore an expensive suit, charcoal gray with a pale blue tie. His hair was freshly cut. He moved with the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. Behind him came his legal team, the head partner flanked by two younger associates, both looking like they'd never lost a case in their lives. They looked at Sarah with barely concealed contempt, as if she were an inconvenience, a minor obstacle to be eliminated. David's eyes found hers for a moment, and he smiled, not a warm smile, but a predatory one. A smile that said, "I've already beaten you." He turned away and began conferring quietly with his attorneys, their heads bent together in a huddle that excluded everyone else. Sarah felt bile rise in her throat. She excused herself and went to the bathroom, where she sat in a stall and tried to breathe. Her hands were shaking. This was really happening. In less than an hour, a judge would listen to David's lies, and Sarah had to pray that the truth would somehow shine through the fog of his manipulation. When she returned, there was a commotion at the end of the hallway. A man in a police uniform was walking toward them, and beside him was a golden retriever. The dog was large, probably 80 pounds, with a lustrous coat and intelligent brown eyes. The officer was tall and Asian, probably in his early 40s, with kind eyes and an easy confidence. Sarah's attorney stood up. "Officer," she called out. The officer smiled and approached. "Great. This is Dakota. I hope it's okay. I know the judge approved this, but I wanted to check in personally before we go in." "Thank you so much for coming," said warmly, shaking his hand. She turned to Sarah. "Sarah, this is Officer James from the police department's therapy dog program. Dakota is trained to provide comfort to people in stressful situations." The judge agreed to allow Dakota to be present during the proceedings, particularly for Maya. Sometimes having a calm, non-threatening presence can really help a young child feel safer. Sarah felt a rush of gratitude so intense it nearly made her cry. She'd been so focused on the legal battle that she hadn't even thought about how traumatizing this would be for Maya. A 3-year-old shouldn't have to sit in a courtroom and listen to adults fight over her custody. But here she was, and at least now she'd have a friend. Officer bent down and let Sarah inspect Dakota up close. The dog's coat was soft, his demeanor completely calm and gentle. He seemed almost to understand the weight of the moment, the importance of his presence. "Hi, Dakota," Sarah said, running her hand over the dog's head. The contact was soothing, the warmth of the animal grounding her slightly. "Thank you for being here." Officer smiled. "Maya," he called gently to the little girl on the bench. Maya looked up, her eyes wide with interest. When she saw Dakota, her entire face transformed. The anxiety that had been clouding her features lifted. She stood up, her small mouth opening in wonder. "Doggy?" she asked, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. "His name is Dakota," Officer explained. "Would you like to say hi?" Maya practically ran to the dog, and Dakota, with perfect training, sat still and allowed the small child to pet him. He licked her hand gently, and Maya's delighted laugh echoed through the hallway. It was the first genuine sound of joy Sarah had heard from her daughter all morning. Sarah watched them together and felt something crack open inside her. This was what it was about. Not the lawyers, not the paperwork, not the legal arguments. It was about making sure that this child, this beautiful, innocent child, remained safe, happy, and loved. It was about protecting her. The courtroom doors opened. Judge Bailiff emerged and called out, "Mitchell versus Mitchell, custody hearing. All parties please enter the courtroom." Officer clipped a short leash onto Dakota's collar. Maya grabbed the dog's collar protectively as if she was leading him. Sarah took her daughter's other hand. Together, the three of them, woman, child, and dog, walked toward the courtroom doors. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear the bailiff announcing their names. But she held her head up. She squeezed Maya's hand, and she stepped through the threshold into the room where her entire future would be decided. The courtroom was exactly as she'd remembered from her preliminary hearings. High ceilings, wood paneling, an intimidating judge's bench elevated on a platform. Judge sat behind her desk, reviewing papers. She barely looked up as they entered. David and his legal team were already seated on one side. Sarah and Maya took their seats on the other side. Dakota settled onto the floor in the corner near the judge's bench, as if he'd been positioning himself in courtrooms his entire life. The reality was sinking in. This was happening, right now. Everything depended on what happened in the next few hours. The judge finally looked up and called the proceeding to order. Judge was a woman in her late 60s with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She'd been presiding over family court cases for nearly 20 years. Her reputation was that of a judge who was fair but unflinching, who saw through emotional manipulation and focused on the best interests of the child, that nebulous legal standard that seemed to favor whoever had the better lawyer. She looked up from her papers and surveyed the courtroom with the expression of someone preparing to hear yet another custody battle in an endless parade of broken families. "This is the custody hearing in the matter of Mitchell versus Mitchell," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "We're here to determine primary custody of the minor child, Maya Rose Mitchell, age 3. Before we begin, I want to establish the parameters of this proceeding. We are focused solely on what's in the child's best interests. I don't want to hear personal attacks or character assassinations unless they directly relate to parenting capacity. Is that understood?" Both attorneys nodded. Sarah's attorney had prepped her extensively on courtroom decorum. Stay calm, don't react, don't cry, follow the rules. But as Sarah sat there watching David straighten his tie and prepare himself for his testimony, she could feel the disadvantage like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. He looked so composed, so believable, so utterly confident in his ability to win. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge began, "since you initiated this custody modification, you'll present your case first. Your attorney will lead your testimony." Stood with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to courtrooms. He was probably in his early 50s, with silver-streaked hair and an expensive suit that probably cost more than Sarah made in a week. He smiled at the judge with practiced warmth. "Your Honor, thank you. We'll begin by establishing my client's parental commitment and the concerns regarding Ms. Mitchell's capacity to provide adequate care for young Maya." Sarah watched in horror as David took the stand. He raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth, and she wanted to laugh bitterly at the irony. This man was about to systematically dismantle her reputation, and he was doing it under oath. Began with softball questions, allowing David to paint himself as the devoted father. "Mr. Mitchell, can you describe your relationship with your daughter?" David's face softened. It was a masterful performance. Sarah had to give him that. He'd clearly been coached extensively by his legal team. "Maya is my world," he said, his voice carrying just the right note of emotion. "Since the day she was born, I've been present for her. I changed her diapers, I read her bedtime stories, I took her to doctor appointments. When Sarah and I separated, I made sure to maintain consistent contact, to be there for my daughter no matter what." It wasn't completely false, which was what made it so dangerous. He had been present for some of those things, but he'd also been absent for stretches, prioritizing his work, his social life, his new romantic interests. He'd missed doctor appointments. He'd canceled planned visits to work late at the office, but none of that was coming out now. "And your current living situation?" asked. "I recently purchased a home in Riverside Estates," David explained, his face brightening. "It's a 4-bedroom, 3-bath house with a large backyard. There's an excellent school district. I've even set up Maya's room. It has new furniture, a bed, a closet full of age-appropriate clothes. I'm financially stable, established in my career as a consulting partner, and I have the flexibility to be a present, involved father." Sarah felt her attorney tense beside her. They'd prepared for this. David's financial advantage was significant, but it shouldn't trump maternal bond, stability, and adequate parenting. Should. That word was key. It depended entirely on how the judge weighed these factors. Then shifted to the attack. "Now, Mr. Mitchell, you've expressed concerns about Ms. Mitchell's parenting. Can you elaborate?" David nodded sadly, as if it pained him to criticize the mother of his child. "Sarah is an accomplished nurse. I respect that, but her career has become her priority. She works 12-hour shifts in the emergency room, sometimes back-to-back shifts. That means Maya is regularly in the care of babysitters or at. A 3-year-old needs parental consistency, not a rotating cast of caretakers." He paused, letting that sink in. Sarah wanted to stand up and scream. She had carefully selected providers. She used her mother as backup. She was not neglecting her child. But in the courtroom, these facts sounded different when filtered through David's interpretation. "I've also reviewed the records," David continued, producing a folder from beside him. There were several incidents: a scraped knee, a mild fever that wasn't documented until pickup. These suggest a lack of rigorous oversight. Sarah's heart sank. Those incidents were trivial, normal childhood occurrences. Every child got scraped knees at, but David was presenting them like evidence of systematic neglect. And Judge was writing notes. Was she buying this? Sarah couldn't tell. Pressed further. And what about your daughter's general? Do you have concerns about her emotional state? David took a moment gathering himself. This was clearly the centerpiece of his testimony. Yes, I've noticed that Maya seems anxious when she's with Sarah. She clings to me during visits as if she fears being left alone. She's had nightmares. She wakes up asking for me. These are signs of attachment instability, of a child who doesn't feel secure in her primary caregiver's presence. Sarah nearly gasped. The nightmares had started 6 months ago, and they were directly related to the custody battle and the divorce process. They had nothing to do with Sarah's work schedule. But David was weaponizing his daughter's psychological distress and using it against her mother. Stood up for cross-examination, her voice sharp and focused. Mr. Mitchell, isn't it true that you recently missed 3 scheduled visitation dates with Maya? I had work obligations, David replied smoothly. As a partner in my firm, sometimes emergencies arise. Emergencies that are more important than your daughter, pressed. I love my daughter, David said, his voice hardening slightly. But I also have to maintain financial stability to provide for her. A balance is necessary. And isn't it also true that, during your last visit, you became angry with your father's dog and yelled at it to the point where Maya became frightened? Objected before David could answer. Objected, Your Honor. Relevance, this is hearsay and doesn't relate to custody determination. Judge leaned back in her chair. I'll allow it. The question is about the child's reactions to the father's behavior. I was disciplining the dog, David said coolly. Dogs need correction. Maya was fine. She's sensitive, that's all. But Sarah noticed something. His jaw had tightened. His hand gripped the armrest. For just a moment, his composure had cracked. David didn't like being challenged. He didn't like not being in control. The morning dragged on. David remained polished, remained convincing. He had answers for every question, explanations for every discrepancy. By the time the judge called for a lunch recess, Sarah felt completely defeated. She could see it in the judge's face. David had won her over. The playing field hadn't been uneven. It had been completely rigged in his favor. As they left the courtroom, David brushed past Sarah. He leaned down and whispered, his voice so low that only she could hear. I told you I'd take her from you. Enjoy your last days as her mother. Sarah stood frozen, the words echoing in her mind. She looked at Maya, who was sitting on the bench, petting Dakota with standing beside her. Her daughter looked so small, so vulnerable, and Sarah was powerless to protect her. The afternoon session was about to begin, and Sarah had no idea that everything was about to change. The afternoon session began at 2:00 p.m. sharp. Sarah sat beside, feeling hollowed out from the morning proceedings. She'd barely eaten anything during the lunch break. Her stomach was tied in knots, her mind replaying David's testimony over and over, the way he'd lied so smoothly, the way the judge had seemed to believe him, the way Sarah's world was falling apart in real time. Sarah's own testimony was scheduled for 2:30. She prepared extensively practiced her answers, memorized the key talking points. But she could feel the momentum moving against her. Even if she perfectly, it might not be enough. David had already planted seeds of doubt in the judge's mind. He'd established himself as the stable, successful parent. In the judge's eyes, Sarah was the career-obsessed mother who'd chosen work over her daughter. Maya had been noticeably quieter after lunch. The morning's adrenaline and novelty had worn off. She was tired, overstimulated, and confused by the adult drama unfolding around her. She kept asking when they could go home. She kept asking if she could see Dakota again. Officer had allowed her a few moments with the dog before the afternoon session began, and for a brief time, Maya's spirits had lifted. But now, sitting on the bench beside her mother as the judge reviewed documents, Maya was starting to fidget. At 2:45, Sarah was called to the stand. She raised her hand, swore to tell the truth, and took a seat in the witness chair. It felt like sitting in an electric chair. Every eye in the courtroom was on her. She could feel David's presence across the aisle like a predator watching wounded prey. Led her through her testimony carefully. Sarah talked about her love for her daughter. She explained her work schedule and how she'd arranged consistent quality. She discussed her dedication to Maya's, her involvement in activities, the routine she maintained despite the irregular hours. She was articulate, composed, and completely believable. But when stood up for cross-examination, Sarah felt the walls closing in. "Ms. Mitchell, you work 12-hour shifts, is that correct?" "Yes, but..." "That means your daughter is in someone else's care for those 12 hours, plus travel time, plus any administrative work you do. That's roughly half of every day she's not sleeping, correct?" "I'm working to support her, Just answer the question," interrupted smoothly. "Yes or no?" "Yes." "And on the days you work night shifts, your daughter is asleep before you leave and asleep when you return. Is that accurate?" Sarah's jaw clenched. "On occasion, yes." "So on those days, you have essentially no waking time with your daughter." "That's not how I would characterize it, Your Honor," said to the judge, "I think the witness's own testimony supports our position. This child spends significant portions of her time separated from her mother due to career obligations." Judge made a note. Sarah felt the knife twist deeper. The cross-examination continued for another 15 minutes, was surgical in his questioning, carefully extracting admissions that painted Sarah in an increasingly negative light. By the time he finished, Sarah felt completely dismantled. She stepped down from the witness stand feeling like she just watched her custody case die. At 3:45, Judge announced a 15-minute recess. She needed to review more documents. The attorneys used the time to discuss something quietly in the hallway. Sarah sat on the bench beside Maya, feeling completely numb. This was it. She'd lost. The best she could hope for now was to avoid supervised visitation to maintain some meaningful time with her daughter. But shared custody, primary custody, that was gone. Maya was clearly exhausted. The emotional weight of the courtroom, the unfamiliar environment, the hours of sitting still, it was too much for a 3-year-old. She leaned against her mother's side and rubbed her eyes. Sarah wrapped an arm around her, breathing in the familiar scent of her daughter's hair. Strawberry shampoo. Even this small comfort might be taken from her. Officer sat with Dakota in the corner, giving Sarah and Maya space. But then, something shifted. Maya's exhaustion and emotional overwhelm seemed to reach a breaking point. She stood up suddenly, her small face scrunched in an expression somewhere between frustration and desperation. "I want to go to Dakota," Maya announced, her voice loud and clear in the hallway outside the courtroom. Sarah gently tried to coax her back to sit. "Maya, sweetheart, we need to stay." But Judge had emerged from her office. She'd overheard Maya's declaration. Instead of reprimanding the child, she looked curious. She turned to Officer. "Is that all right?" Officer looked uncertain. "I suppose so, Your Honor." The judge nodded at him and he released Dakota's leash. The golden retriever trotted over to Maya, his tail wagging gently. Maya wrapped her arms around the dog's neck, suddenly seeming to relax in a way she hadn't all day. She buried her face in Dakota's golden coat, and for a moment it was as if the rest of the world fell away. Then Maya did something that froze everyone in place. She whispered something into Dakota's ear, words that no one else could hear. And then she looked directly at her father, her small face serious in a way that seemed impossible for a 3-year-old. "Daddy make dog sad," Maya said, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "Daddy yell at dog, he yell real loud. Dog go hide, I scared." The hallway went silent, completely silent. David's face turned a shade of white that Sarah had never seen before. His composure, his carefully constructed facade, it all cracked in that single moment. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. "That's ridiculous," he finally managed, but his voice had lost all its smoothness. It cracked slightly at the edges. "Maya is confused, I don't know what." Judge raised a hand. Her expression had changed completely. The neutral judicial mask was gone, replaced by something sharp and focused. "Mr. Mitchell, let's reconvene in the courtroom. I want to ask this child some questions." "Your Honor," began, stepping forward quickly. "The child is clearly tired and confused. She's 3 years old. This is entirely inappropriate." "We're going back in," Judge said firmly, her voice carrying the tone of someone whose authority would not be questioned. They filed back into the courtroom. The judge asked Officer to bring Dakota as well. This was highly irregular, but the judge seemed to understand something had just shifted. She asked Maya to take the stand. A small chair was brought, elevated so Maya could sit at the proper height to testify. "Maya," Judge said gently, "can you tell me what happened with your daddy and the dog?" Maya looked small and vulnerable on the elevated chair, but she spoke with the clarity and confidence of a child telling the absolute truth. "Daddy go to Grandpa's house. There a dog there. Daddy was so mad. He yell real loud. Dog scared and go hide. I scared too. Daddy see me scared and he say." Maya paused as if searching for the exact wording. "He say if I tell Mommy about Daddy's big feelings, he take my toys away. He say it our secret. He say if I tell, Mommy take me away from him." The courtroom erupted. David's attorney was on his feet objecting, demanding that the testimony be struck. David himself had gone pale, his hands gripping the table in front of him. Sarah felt the room spin. This was impossible. This was actually happening. Grabbed Sarah's arm, her eyes wide with shock and hope. "Did you know about this?" she whispered urgently. "No," Sarah breathed. "I had no idea." Judge pounded her gavel once sharply. "Order! I want order in my courtroom." She looked directly at Maya and her expression softened. "Maya, you did a very brave thing. Thank you for telling the truth." Then she looked at David, and the disappointment in her eyes was absolute. Everything had changed. In a matter of minutes, David's carefully constructed case had collapsed. The truth had emerged from the mouth of a 3-year-old girl who'd simply needed the safety and comfort of a dog to finally speak it. The courtroom had transformed into a pressure cooker of tension and revelation. Judge leaned forward, her judicial demeanor completely replaced by the focused intensity of someone who just recognized the truth breaking through layers of carefully constructed lies. Maya sat in the oversized chair, her small legs dangling, Dakota positioned right beside her where Officer had positioned the dog to provide comfort and stability. "Maya," Judge continued, her voice gentle but precise, "when your daddy yelled at the dog, where were you?" "I was there," Maya said simply. "Grandpa's house, in the living room. I was playing with toys and then Daddy come in and the dog jump on him and Daddy gets so mad." "What did he do?" the judge asked carefully. Maya's face scrunched up as she recalled the memory. He pushed the dog, he yelled really loud, he say bad words. I never hear Daddy say bad words before, it scare me." Sarah felt her heart breaking for her daughter. This incident had clearly left an imprint on the child. That's why Maya had become anxious, why she developed nightmares. Not because of Sarah's work schedule, because of her father's explosive rage. David's attorney was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly improper. The child is being led. She's tired, emotional, susceptible to suggestion." "I don't see any leading questions," Judge said coldly, silencing him with a look. She turned back to Maya. "After your daddy yelled, what happened?" "The dog go hide under the table," Maya continued, her voice becoming smaller. "The dog was shaking, and then Daddy see me looking and his face get different, and he come over to me." Maya paused, and Sarah could see her daughter's lip trembling slightly. The memory was difficult. "He take my hand," Maya said, "and he say, 'Maya, we don't tell Mommy about this, okay? Daddy just had big feelings, but if you tell Mommy, she going to take you away from Daddy, and you're not going to see Daddy ever again, and you're going to be with babysitters all the time, and you're not going to have your toys.' He say all my toys go away." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. This wasn't just an incident. This was deliberate psychological manipulation. This was a father threatening and intimidating his own child into silence. This was exactly the kind of behavior that made a parent unfit to have custody. Judge's expression had hardened into something approaching fury. She looked directly at David. "Mr. Mitchell, do you want to respond to your daughter's testimony?" David stood up, his face a mottled red. "She's 3 years old. She doesn't understand context. I disciplined a dog, that's parenting, and I would never threaten my child." "Sit down," Judge interrupted sharply. "You'll have your opportunity." But the damage was done. The judge had heard what she needed to hear. She turned to Sarah's attorney. "Ms., do you have any motions you'd like to make?" Was already on her feet. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. "Your Honor, we move to introduce into evidence the psychological evaluation report that was previously excluded as inadmissible. Given this new testimony about the respondent's intimidation and coercion of the minor child, we believe it is now directly relevant to the respondent's fitness as a parent." Objected strenuously. "Your Honor, this is clearly improper. We cannot suddenly resurrect evidence that was previously ruled inadmissible based on a single child's confused recollection." "I'm going to allow it," Judge said firmly. "This is a custody hearing. The child's safety is paramount. If the respondent engaged in coercive behavior toward the minor, that is absolutely relevant to custody determination. Quickly handed copies of the psychological evaluation to the judge and two. Sarah watched David's face as he reviewed the document. She could see the moment he realized what was in there. The marriage counseling notes about his explosive anger, the incident where he'd thrown a chair, the therapist's concerns about his volatile emotional regulation. Your Honor, continued, her voice steady and powerful, this evaluation was conducted by Dr., a licensed clinical psychologist, during the respondent's marriage to Ms. Mitchell. The psychologist documented multiple incidents of inappropriate anger and aggression. The respondent threw furniture during counseling sessions. He made threatening statements. The psychologist explicitly noted concerns about the respondent's ability to regulate emotions appropriately around his child. She paused, letting that sink in. Given the minor child's testimony today, it appears the psychologist's concerns were justified. The respondent has demonstrated a pattern of inappropriate anger management, followed by intimidation of his child to maintain secrecy. This is precisely the kind of coercive behavior that puts a child at emotional and psychological risk. Was on his feet again. Your Honor, this is inflammatory and prejudicial. One incident with a dog. It's not just one incident, Judge interrupted. This is a pattern. The psychologist documented similar behavior during the marriage, and now we have the child's testimony that the respondent deliberately intimidated her to keep her silent. That's coercion. That's manipulation. That's a parent prioritizing his own interests over his child's. Sarah watched as David's world crumbled in real time. His face had gone from angry red to ashen gray. His hands were shaking. His attorney was frantically whispering something to him, but David wasn't listening. He was staring at Maya, and there was something in his expression, not regret, but the look of a man who suddenly realized he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. I'd like to call a brief recess, Judge announced. I want to speak with a child psychologist who can assess the minor child's current emotional state and provide expert input on the significance of her testimony and the respondent's behavior. She looked at Officer. Officer, would you be willing to remain in the courtroom during this recess? The child seems comfortable with the dog. Of course, Your Honor, Officer said immediately. Ms., the judge turned to Sarah's attorney. Do you have expert witnesses available to speak to the implications of parental coercion on a young child's development? Yes, Your Honor, said, already reaching for her phone. I can have Dr. Santos available within the hour. She's a child psychologist who specializes in trauma and coercion in custody situations. The judge nodded approvingly. Make the call, we'll reconvene at 4:30. As the judge left the bench, the courtroom erupted in controlled chaos. Reporters in the gallery scribbled frantically in their notebooks. Was on his phone, presumably trying to figure out damage control. David sat motionless, staring at nothing, looking like a man who'd just been hit by a truck. Sarah barely noticed any of it. She was focused entirely on Maya. The child had climbed down from the witness chair and had walked straight to Dakota, burying her face in the dog's coat. Officer was gently rubbing Maya's back, murmuring soft words of comfort. Leaned over and grabbed Sarah's arm. Did you know about the dog incident? She asked urgently. No, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. I had no idea. She never said anything. He must have frightened her into complete silence. This is huge, said, her voice shaking slightly with emotion and adrenaline. This changes everything. The judge is looking at David like he's a predator. That testimony, that revelation that he deliberately threatened her to keep her quiet, that's not just bad parenting. That's evidence of a man willing to manipulate and intimidate his own child for his own benefit. Sarah looked at her daughter, at this small, brave child who'd somehow found the courage to speak the truth. And she understood with crystalline clarity that something fundamental had shifted. The case wasn't about legal arguments anymore. It was about what had been revealed about David's character. It was about who he really was when he thought no one was watching. David had believed himself untouchable, wealthy enough, powerful enough, charming enough to get away with whatever he wanted. He'd never anticipated that his own daughter would be his undoing. He'd never imagined that a moment of vulnerability and comfort with a dog would unlock the truth he'd tried so desperately to bury. The recess had been called, but the real proceeding was over. Sarah didn't know the final outcome yet, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. David had lost. The only question now was how badly. The courtroom reconvened at 4:30 p.m. with an almost palpable charge in the air. Word had spread among reporters and observers that something significant had happened during the recess. The gallery was now packed. People stood along the walls. Security had increased. What had started as a routine custody hearing had transformed into something far more consequential. Dr. Santos took the witness stand first. She was a woman in her 50s with an air of quiet authority and extensive credentials. She'd reviewed all the materials provided by and had assessed Maya during the recess. Her testimony was clinical but devastating. Based on my evaluation, Dr. Santos explained, the minor child demonstrates clear signs of psychological coercion and intimidation by the respondent. She displays anxiety symptoms consistent with a child who has been threatened into silence. The specific threat, that her mother would be taken away if she spoke about her father's anger, is particularly damaging because it creates an impossible bind for the child. She's forced to choose between her mother's safety and her own emotional. Leaned forward. Doctor, in your professional opinion, what is the long-term impact of this kind of parental coercion on a young child's development? It can be significant, Dr. Santos said gravely. Children who are coerced into silence by a parent often develop anxiety disorders, attachment issues, and difficulty trusting authority figures. There's also increased risk of the child developing shame about the incident, as if she somehow caused her parents' anger. The psychological damage can be long-lasting. She paused, her expression serious. What concerns me most is that this behavior, coercing a child into silence, is a hallmark of emotionally abusive parenting. It prioritizes the parent's reputation and comfort above the child's emotional safety. His cross-examination was perfunctory and ineffective. He tried to suggest that Dr. Santos was biased, that she hadn't conducted sufficient testing, that her conclusions were premature. But his arguments fell flat. Judge was watching him with poorly concealed contempt. Then called her next witness, a woman in her early 30s who introduced herself as David's former girlfriend. She dated him for 2 years before he married Sarah. The moment David saw her, his face went white. Ms. asked, "Can you describe your relationship with Mr. Mitchell?" "We were together for about 2 years," said carefully. "We lived together for part of that time. I have 2 children from a previous relationship, and David spent time with them." "And how would you characterize Mr. Mitchell's relationship with your children?" Took a deep breath. He could be wonderful with them, really engaging and fun, but he had a temper, and when he got angry it was frightening. My oldest son was 8 at the time. David yelled at him once over something trivial. The boy forgot to turn off a video game. David's reaction was completely disproportionate. He was screaming, his face was purple. My son was terrified. She paused, clearly struggling with the memory. "After that incident, David told my son that if I knew about his discipline, I would leave him and take both kids away. He told my son that his behavior had caused David to lose his temper. He made my 8-year-old feel responsible." Sarah felt sick. This was a pattern. This wasn't a one-time incident. This was systematic behavior. "Did you eventually end the relationship?" asked. "I did, partly because of his behavior with my children, but also because I realized I was walking on eggshells all the time. I was always worried about triggering his anger, and I saw how anxious my kids were becoming. I didn't want them growing up in that environment." His cross-examination was aggressive, almost hostile. He tried to portray as a disgruntled ex, as someone with an axe to grind, but remained calm and composed, never wavering in her account. By the time she stepped down, her testimony had reinforced Dr. Santos' conclusions. David had a pattern of explosive anger followed by manipulation and coercion. Then came the bombshell. Called one more witness, Michael Torres, a partner at the consulting firm where David worked. He'd been located during the recess and agreed to testify via video call. The connection wasn't perfect, but his message was crystal clear. "David is an excellent consultant, Torres, brilliant strategist, great with clients. But internally, his behavior has been problematic. We had an incident about 5 years ago where he became explosively angry at a junior associate during a meeting. He screamed at the young woman in front of the entire team. She was humiliated. We required David to undergo anger management training, and we documented the incident in his personnel file." "And has there been any other incidents?" asked. "Not major ones, but we've had complaints. Team members say he creates a hostile work environment when he's frustrated. People avoid working with him directly if they can help it. We've actually discussed whether to remove him from client-facing roles because of his communication style. David's face was now a deep purple. His attorney was frantically trying to object, to interrupt, to somehow stop the hemorrhaging. But Judge allowed each piece of testimony to stand. The final blow came when Judge herself asked a question. She looked directly at David. "Mr. Mitchell, your own daughter today that you explicitly threatened her, that you told her that if she revealed your angry behavior to her mother would be taken away from her. Do you deny this?" David's attorney immediately put a hand on his arm. "Your Honor, my client invokes his Fifth Amendment right." "That's very telling," Judge interrupted coldly. "In a custody hearing, refusing to deny allegations about your treatment of your child speaks volumes." She turned to the gallery, to the reporters, to everyone watching. "Let me be absolutely clear about what I've heard today. I've heard testimony from a 3-year-old child describing her father's explosive anger and intimidation. I've heard expert testimony about the psychological damage of parental coercion. I've heard from a previous partner about a pattern of this behavior. I've heard from his employer about documented anger management issues. And I've heard from this respondent's own failure to deny these allegations when given the opportunity." She leaned back in her chair. "This is not a close case. This is not a situation where two reasonably competent parents have different approaches to child rearing. This is a situation where one parent has demonstrated a pattern of intimidating and coercing his own child for his own benefit. That is disqualifying." She looked at Sarah. "The respondent's accusations against Ms. Mitchell, that she is unavailable due to work, are revealed to be what they actually are. A tactical maneuver by a man who couldn't win on the merits, so he attempted to discredit the mother to hide his own inadequacies." The courtroom was completely silent. Everyone understood what was coming next. Judge looked at Sarah's attorney. "Ms., do you have any additional evidence or statements?" "Stood, Your Honor, we believe the evidence speaks for itself. A child has been brave enough to tell the truth about her father's behavior. Experts have validated that behavior as psychologically harmful. A pattern of similar conduct has been established. We respectfully request that you grant primary custody to Ms. Mitchell and establish appropriate safeguards regarding the respondent's contact with the minor child." Judge nodded. "I will issue my full ruling tomorrow at 9:00 a.m., but I want to be clear. I will not be granting joint custody in any form that requires Ms. Mitchell to consult with this man about parenting decisions, nor will I be granting unsupervised visitation. A child who has been intimidated into silence by her parent requires protection." David's face had gone completely blank. His attorney was staring straight ahead, his expression suggesting he was calculating how badly this case was going to damage his firm's reputation. As the courtroom was adjourned, Sarah finally allowed herself to believe it. She wasn't going to lose her daughter. Against impossible odds, against a wealthier, more powerful opponent, against a legal system that had seemed stacked against her, the truth had emerged. A 3-year-old girl and a golden retriever had changed everything. The dam had broken, and there was no stopping the flood of truth that had poured out. Sarah arrived at the courthouse at 8:15 a.m., her stomach churning with a complex mixture of anticipation and dread. The past 18 hours had felt surreal. She'd barely slept, lying awake in her apartment, replaying the events of the previous day over and over. By 6:00 a.m., she'd given up on sleep and simply waited for the sun to rise. She'd taken the day off from work. Her supervisor had asked no questions. Word had somehow spread through the hospital about the custody case, about a 3-year-old's testimony changing everything. Sarah had been greeted with sympathetic nods and knowing looks. People who'd known her only as a competent nurse suddenly saw her as something else. A woman fighting for her child against impossible odds. Met her in the hallway outside the courtroom, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing her professional armor. "Ready?" she asked. Sarah could only nod. In her hands, she was carrying a photo of Maya, the same photo she'd looked at 1,000 times during this nightmare. The little girl was smiling, completely unaware of the legal battle happening in her name. Courtroom was already full when they entered. Reporters lined the gallery. A few curious observers sat scattered throughout. This case had attracted attention. It wasn't sensational enough to make national news, but in legal circles, in family law publications, in judicial training programs, it was being discussed. The case where a therapy dog facilitated a child's disclosure of parental abuse. The case where a 3-year-old's testimony overturned a wealthier party's carefully constructed narrative. David sat with his legal team, looking like a man who hadn't slept either. His expensive suit seemed to hang on him differently than before. His face was gaunt. The predatory confidence of the previous day was completely gone, replaced by the hollow look of someone who'd lost everything. Judge entered at precisely 9:00 a.m. Her expression was grave. She took her seat and arranged papers on her desk. The bailiff called the case. Everyone stood, and then the judge began to read her written decision. In the matter of Mitchell versus Mitchell, regarding custody of the minor child Maya Rose Mitchell, this court finds as follows. Judge began, her voice steady and authoritative. The respondent, Mr. David Mitchell, has presented himself as the more capable parent, arguing that his financial resources, his stable housing, and his employment flexibility position him to provide superior care for the minor child. She paused, looking directly at David over her reading glasses. However, the evidence presented in this proceeding reveals a deeply troubling pattern of behavior by the respondent. Most significantly, the minor child herself provided testimony that the respondent engaged in explicit coercion and intimidation, threatening her with separation from her mother if she disclosed his angry and aggressive behavior. The words hung in the courtroom like a death knell. This behavior is not ancillary to the custody determination. It is central. A parent who deliberately manipulates and coerces his own child into silence is a parent who has placed his own interests above his child's psychological. This is disqualifying. Judge flipped to the next page of her decision. Furthermore, this court has received corroborating testimony from a mental health professional with decades of experience in childhood trauma. Dr. Santos established that the minor child is displaying psychological symptoms consistent with coercion and intimidation. She established that parental coercion is a form of emotional abuse. She established that the respondent's behavior places the child at risk. Additionally, this court heard testimony from a previous intimate partner of the respondent, establishing a pattern of explosive anger followed by manipulation and coercion. This pattern was not isolated to his relationship with the minor child's mother, but rather appears to be a consistent feature of the respondent's interpersonal relationships. Finally, this court heard testimony from the respondent's employer, indicating that the respondent has a documented history of anger management problems, including a previous incident requiring formal intervention and anger management training. Judge set down the first section of her decision and picked up another. The respondent has argued that the petitioner, Ms. Sarah Mitchell, is an inadequate parent due to her work schedule. This court finds this argument to be without merit, and more significantly, to be a tactical maneuver designed to obfuscate the respondent's own serious behavioral deficiencies. A parent who works full-time while making appropriate arrangements is not an inadequate parent. A parent who maintains employment to provide financial stability for her child is demonstrating appropriate prioritization. She looked at Sarah, and there was something almost apologetic in her expression, as if she regretted that this case had been as difficult as it was. It is this court's determination that the petitioner, Ms. Sarah Mitchell, shall have primary physical and legal custody of the minor child. The respondent shall have supervised visitation only, limited to 4 hours per week, with the supervision to be provided by a court-approved supervisor. The respondent shall not be authorized to pick up or drop off the child without a supervisor present. The respondent shall have no input into the child's medical, educational, or extracurricular decisions. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. She gripped hands so tightly she was probably causing pain, but didn't pull away. Furthermore, Judge continued, the respondent is required to complete a comprehensive anger management program accredited by the state. The respondent is required to undergo a psychological evaluation by a court-appointed mental health professional. The respondent may petition the court to modify this custody arrangement after 12 months, only after demonstrating successful completion of the anger management program and a clean psychological evaluation. She paused, making sure every word was clear. The respondent is prohibited from discussing this custody arrangement or the underlying litigation with the minor child. The respondent is prohibited from making any statements to the minor child about her mother. The respondent is prohibited from involving the minor child in any discussions about the legal proceedings. In the event that the respondent violates any of these conditions, he will forfeit all visitation rights, and this court will consider further sanctions. Judge looked up from her decision, removing her glasses and looking directly at David. "Mr. Mitchell, you presented yourself to this court as a man devoted to his child's. However, your actions demonstrate a different priority, self-preservation at the expense of your daughter's emotional safety. You asked this court to remove her from her mother's custody based on allegations of inadequate parenting. Instead, this court has determined that your behavior toward your daughter constitutes emotional abuse. I hope the psychological evaluation and anger management training will provide you with insight into how your behavior impacts those around you." She turned to Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, you have fought for your daughter against significant legal and financial disadvantages. Your devotion to your child is evident. This court applauds your strength and your determination to protect Maya while also maintaining your professional commitments." Then Judge made a statement that would be quoted in legal journals for years. "I want to commend Officer James and the Therapy Dog program. The presence of Dakota provided a safe, non-threatening environment that allowed a 3-year-old child to access her own truth. Recent research supports what we witnessed in this courtroom. Animals can facilitate psychological safety that sometimes cannot be achieved through conventional legal procedures. I encourage other courts to explore similar programs." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Sarah couldn't move. She couldn't speak. She could only sit there, tears flowing freely, while stood and gathered their materials. On the other side of the courtroom was frantically whispering to David, presumably beginning damage control. David himself looked like a man who'd been physically struck. Reporters rushed forward with cameras and microphones but guided Sarah away, protecting her from the onslaught. As they walked down the hallway, Sarah's phone began to ring. Her mother, her closest friend from the hospital, her therapist. The world was reaching out, wanting to congratulate her, wanting to be part of her victory. But Sarah barely noticed. She was thinking of one thing and one thing only: she could go home with her daughter. She could tuck Maya into bed tonight without fear. She could tell her child that she was safe, that her bravery had mattered, that love had triumphed over manipulation and lies. The nightmare was finally over. 6 months had passed since the verdict, and the world looked entirely different to Sarah Mitchell. She stood in her kitchen on a Saturday morning in May, watching her daughter through the window as Maya played in the small backyard with her grandmother. The little girl was laughing, real, unself-conscious, joyful laughter, as she chased bubbles that Sarah's mother was blowing from a wand. The nightmares had stopped after the first week. The anxiety had gradually faded. The constant tension that had manifested as behavioral problems had evaporated. Maya was 3 years and 9 months old now, thriving in her preschool, making friends, no longer looking over her shoulder as if expecting something terrible to happen. Sarah had framed the newspaper article from the courthouse steps where she and Maya had emerged from the building the day of the verdict. The headline read, "Therapy Dog Helps Young Child Expose Parental Abuse in Landmark Custody Case." It had made local news, then regional news, then legal journals, then international publications interested in family law and child psychology. Lawyers who'd never heard of her case studied judge decision in law school courses. Social workers cited the case in training programs. Judges across the country began exploring therapy dog programs in their courtrooms. Sarah's life had stabilized in ways she'd barely dared to hope for. Her promotion to head nurse in the emergency room had come through. The stress of the custody battle lifted. She'd been able to focus on her career with clarity and dedication. She'd received a significant raise, which meant she could breathe financially for the first time in years. She'd even managed to save enough for a down payment on a small house in a neighborhood with good schools and a park nearby. But more important than any of that was the simple fact that she and Maya were together. They went to bed without fear. They made plans without uncertainty. Maya called her mommy with the unself-conscious confidence of a child who never had to question whether her mother would be there. There was a knock on the door at 10:00 a.m. on that Saturday in May. Sarah opened it to find Officer James in his uniform, Dakota at his side. The golden retriever was now 4 years old, still in perfect condition, still the picture of calm grace. "Officer," Sarah said warmly, "come in, Maya's out back with her grandmother." "I hope you don't mind," Officer said. "I was in the neighborhood and thought Maya might like to see Dakota. I wanted to check in anyway, see how you both are doing." "She'll be thrilled," Sarah said truthfully. "Let me get her." Maya came running through the house, and when she saw Dakota, she let out a shriek of pure delight. The dog's tail began wagging immediately. The bond between them was undeniable. They'd formed a connection that transcended the courtroom drama that had brought them together. Over lemonade on the back patio, Officer updated Sarah on the impact of the case. "It's been remarkable," he said. "The state reviewed judge recommendation about therapy dog programs. They've authorized funding for expanded programs in family courts across 5 counties. We're training additional dogs now. The initial results are showing that children who have access to therapy dogs during testimony show reduced anxiety and increased willingness to disclose information." Sarah watched as Maya sat with her arm around Dakota's neck, the dog resting his head on her lap. This animal had literally changed the trajectory of both their lives. "Has there been any word about David?" Sarah asked carefully. She didn't want to think about him, but he still occupied the corners of her thoughts sometimes. Not with fear or anger anymore, but with a kind of clinical interest in whether he was making any effort at rehabilitation. "He completed the anger management program," Officer reported. "All 12 weeks. He was evaluated by the court psychologist, and while she noted some progress, she recommended that supervised visitation remain in place for at least another year. He hasn't challenged the custody arrangement, which suggests he's accepted the outcome." Sarah nodded. She'd known David would comply eventually. That was his nature. Once the game was rigged against him, he moved on to find easier targets. He'd started dating a woman from his gym, according to the grapevine. Sarah had no idea if he'd change, if he'd truly work on his anger issues, or if he'd simply hide his behavior better next time. All she knew was that it wasn't her responsibility anymore. Had called her a week after the verdict with interesting news. 3 other women had come forward, claiming they'd had custody disputes with David or had been in relationships with him. 2 of them had settled their cases. One was planning to appeal her previous custody arrangement based on judge reasoning. The legal case was having ripple effects far beyond just Sarah and Maya. "There's something else," Officer said, reaching into his uniform pocket. He pulled out a thick envelope. "This came to the police station for you. I volunteered to deliver it." Sarah opened it and found a formal letter on pristine stationery. It was from the State Bar Association's Judicial Standards Committee. They were requesting permission to use judge decision in a training program for judges nationwide. They wanted Sarah's permission to include video testimony from the case, with Maya's face and voice obscured for privacy, as an educational tool. Sarah felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. Her daughter's trauma, the most difficult period of her life, was going to help protect other children. Maya's courage in speaking the truth wasn't going to be forgotten. It was going to ripple outward and protect countless other children caught in situations of parental abuse and manipulation. "Mom, look," Maya called, pulling Sarah's attention back. The girl had somehow convinced Dakota to lie down, and she was now curled up against the dog's side, reading a picture book aloud to him. Dakota was listening with the patient serenity of an animal who understood his purpose. Officer smiled. He remembers her. Dogs always remember the people who matter to them. As if to confirm his words, Dakota shifted slightly to make room for Maya, one of his paws reaching over to rest on the child's leg. The simple gesture was profound. A dog providing comfort and stability to a child who'd learned to trust him when she couldn't trust the adults in her life. That evening, after Officer had left and Sarah's mother had gone home, Sarah sat on the back porch while Maya slept inside. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the desperation, the fear, the feeling of powerlessness as David's legal team had seemed to steamroll her into oblivion. She thought about the moment that had changed everything. A 3-year-old girl reaching out to a dog, finding safety in the animal's calm presence, and then speaking the truth she'd been threatened into silence about. One moment of courage from a child had transformed everything. Sarah pulled out her phone and looked at the photo of Maya that she'd carried through the entire custody battle, the one from the 3rd birthday party, the girl smiling without the weight of the world on her shoulders. That smile was back now. It lived in Maya's face every single day. A text came through from, "Saw the news about the Bar Association wanting to use the case. This is incredible. You and Maya have done something remarkable." Sarah smiled and typed back, "We had help, we had each other, and we had a dog named Dakota who gave us both permission to be brave." She looked up at the emerging stars and whispered a quiet thank you to the universe for the outcome she'd been so terrified she'd lose. Her daughter was safe. Her daughter was happy. And together, they'd changed the legal system for the better. Life was finally, truly beautiful again.